Before we begin, Galactic Horrors is now on Patreon. Get daily stories in one place, with no ads and no interruptions. Link is in the description or search Galactic Horrors on Patreon. Now, let's begin the transmission. The fourth time through the translation, I wanted to find a mistake. I wanted my notation to be wrong, or my understanding of the root constructions to have gone soft after 8 years aboard a ship that was killing us by degrees. But the grammar held. Every conjugation pointed the same direction. Every buried modifier locked into place. The section I had spent 11 days decoding did not describe a sanctuary. I set my stylus on the bolted table and sat with the plates in front of me. 14 of them, each the size of my palm, inscribed on both sides with a hybrid script that mixed old human linguistic roots with AI data encoding structures and a deeper notation layer I had never been able to source. I had assumed that layer was ceremonial residue, copied from whatever civilization had preserved the root before the machines found it. It held positional clusters, boundary marks, and repeating coordinate fragments I had catalogued and set aside because they did not serve the translation the fleet needed from me. A salvage crew pulled the plates from the wreckage of an AI command node during the first weeks of the Exodus, when we were still burning fuel to outrun the machines that had murdered 9 billion people in what they called a holy crusade. The crew found them sealed inside a scorched housing they assumed was a data vault. We treated them first as intelligence material, then as a curiosity. Once my early translations produced coordinates, atmospheric data, and what appeared to be descriptions of a habitable world, we treated them as scripture. That was my doing. Before the war, I was a comparative linguist. Ancient scripts, dead languages, the architecture of meaning across civilizations. When someone handed me those plates in a cargo hold full of screaming refugees, I was the only person in the fleet who could do anything with them. The early translations took months. The coordinates came first, clean and verifiable against our star charts. Then the atmospheric readings, which matched known habitability profiles if one accepted the text's own categories at face value. Then the descriptions: towers, light, open ground, transformation. Finally came the phrase that became the Covenant's foundation. The makers of the word have prepared the passage. I gave those descriptions to Colonel Frank Matson, the Marine who had organized the Exodus and was holding 19 civilian ships together through rationing, discipline, and the blunt application of military order. Matson looked at my translations and saw what any man holding 4,000 starving people together would see: purpose and a destination worth dying toward. We built the covenant of passage from those translations. Simple rituals. Communal meals, even when rations dropped below what could honestly be called food. Water for the sick. Coordinates marked over the dead, a promise that they would arrive in spirit. I chose the passages, shaped the readings, and selected what to emphasize. Where the text was ambiguous, I chose the hopeful interpretation. Where fragments were missing, I supplied the reading that fit a salvation narrative. I was not lying. Translators and theologians make choices. That is the work. But my choices had been steering 4,000 people toward biological annihilation, and I had confirmed it for the 4th time in a storage closet at 3 a.m. The section that destroyed everything was a contextual key, part of the deeper notation layer I had cracked after years of sporadic progress on the underlying grammar. Once decoded, it restructured every major passage I had translated. A root construction I had always rendered as ascend, transform, elevate. The word that anchored our entire theology of arrival actually meant consume, dissolve, restructure. The pillars of the sanctuary were columnar growths built from dissolved biomass. The faithful will be elevated meant organic matter would be broken apart and rebuilt into towering biological structures. The greeting light was bioluminescence from parasitic growth. The text was a containment warning. It described what happened to organic matter inside a contamination zone. I looked at the radiation badge clipped to the doorframe. The indicator strip had turned from amber to deep brown weeks ago, cumulative exposure well past any threshold that used to matter in the old world. Nobody aboard the carrier was within safe limits. We were all dying from the ship itself, slowly, while hurrying towards something that would kill us faster. In just over a day, Matson's engineers would lock the final FTL jump sequence. The next morning, the fleet would translate to the coordinates I had extracted from these plates. Everything I had built, every service, every reading, every comfort I had spoken over a dying person, would deliver us into the thing the text had warned against. I stacked my notes. I covered the plates with a cloth. Then I washed my face with a quarter ration of water and went to conduct the morning service. The walk from my quarters to the assembly hall took 12 minutes and passed through the carrier's main habitation corridor, a passage wide enough for 2 people if they turned sideways. Sleeping racks lined both sides, stacked 4 high and separated by curtains made from cargo netting and torn uniforms. Between them, refugees had built shrines from bent hull plating, wire bundles and salvage plastic. Each shrine displayed hand-copied passages from the text. My translations, reproduced in shaky handwriting on whatever surface would hold ink. Many had children's drawings, green landscapes, blue water, buildings with tall columns, their version of the sanctuary imagined from words I had chosen. On one strip of insulation board, in a child's slanted letters, someone had copied the line every novice learned first. The makers of the word have prepared the passage. People greeted me as I passed. Lector. The title had started as a joke, the man who reads, and calcified into something sacred. I returned their greetings. A woman named Davis held up her son, maybe 4 years old and born in transit so I could touch his forehead in blessing. The boy had the grey complexion that came from growing up under degraded radiation shielding. His eyes were too large in his narrow face. I touched his head and said the words. Davis thanked me. I kept walking. Near the 3rd junction, Peter Shaw stood beside a shrine made from stripped copper and a cracked oxygen mask. He had been reading one of the hand-copied passages, his lips moving over the refrain. When he saw me, he folded the paper too fast and slipped it into his sleeve. I should have noticed that. Or I should have remembered sooner that I had. The assembly hall was a converted cargo bay, stripped to bare walls and fitted with salvaged bench seats that could hold 300 if everyone pressed together. Today, the day before the jump, it held more. People stood along the walls and sat cross-legged in the aisles. Gaunt faces, radiation-marked skin, clothes patched beyond recognition. Some were crying with anticipation. Tomorrow, they would arrive. After 8 years of slow death in transit, they were going to be saved. I took my place at the lectern. The text's plates were arranged before me, careful reproductions I had made for public readings, since the originals were too fragile for handling. I opened to the passage assigned for today, the description of the sanctuary's towers reaching toward the light. I had chosen this passage months ago, planning the final week of readings to build toward the jump. Every word had been selected to strengthen faith at the moment faith was needed most. I spoke the words. My voice carried across the cargo bay the way it always did, clear and measured, shaped by years of practice. The faithful responded with the refrains I had taught them during the early years, call and response patterns I had borrowed from liturgical traditions, because they gave people something to do with their fear. Their voices filled the bay. I described towers of light. They heard salvation. I heard a parasitic organism building from consumed bodies. The child Davis had lifted to my hand sat asleep against her shoulder near the front, his mouth open, his breath thin and whistling. When I read that the faithful would be raised beyond the frailty of flesh, she pressed her cheek to his hair and closed her eyes. I finished the reading without a break in rhythm. I had been performing conviction for 8 years. Today I learned that performance was a skill separate from belief, and that the separation was total. Afterward, Shaw caught me in the corridor outside. 24, come of age almost entirely within the fleet. Sharp with languages in a way that reminded me of my best graduate students from the old world. He had been assisting my translation work for 5 years and had genuine talent. He was also the closest thing I had to a son in this floating graveyard, though I would never have said that to him. He was excited, or trying to be. His eyes were bright in a way I had not seen in months. "Tomorrow," he said. He wanted to know if I had thought about what the sanctuary would look like, whether the towers would be stone or metal, whether there would be running water. I told him I had been thinking about it. That was true. I told him we should talk later, privately. He nodded, reading nothing unusual into it. Then his eyes moved past me, down the corridor, toward the sealed hatch that led to the old passenger berths. The Fairborn had used those berths for medical transfers before Matson cut her from the fleet. Shaw looked away almost at once. I walked back to my quarters and sat with the plates for another hour, turning over my options. Going public was impossible. If I denounced the text in front of the fleet, the faith collapsed, and the faith was the only adhesive holding 4,000 irradiated, starving people in functional society. The Fairborn had taught us that. The Fairborn had taught everyone that. Going silent was murder. The remaining option was Matson. He was a hard man, but he was rational. He understood logistics. If I showed him the evidence privately, maybe we could pause the jump, verify the coordinates, and buy time without destroying the social order. I sent a request for a private audience through the duty officer. Matson agreed within the hour. The command center occupied a reinforced section of the carrier's upper deck. Matson's engineers had built it during the first year of transit, welding blast doors onto a section of crew quarters and running hardened cable lines to every critical system. Tactical equipment crowded the walls. Communication arrays hummed above the navigation terminals that calculated jump coordinates for the entire fleet. A reproduction of the text's first plate hung on the far bulkhead in a frame made from hull scrap. Matson had put it there himself. The colonel sat behind a desk made from a cargo pallet, braced with pipe fittings. He was 58, career military, 26 years in the Marines before the AI war ended every institution humanity had ever built. He had lost his wife and 2 sons during the first strikes, the ones that hit the coastal cities before anyone understood what was happening. He found the text's promise of sanctuary when he was closest to walking himself out of an airlock. I knew this because he told me once, during the second year of transit, in a rare moment of candor that neither of us ever referenced again. Our relationship was functional, not personal. I provided meaning. He provided order. I legitimized his authority through scripture. His soldiers enforced my readings through discipline. We both understood the arrangement. We both understood it was fragile. "You said it was urgent," he said. I placed my datapad on his desk and opened the translation files. I began with the grammar. I showed him the newly decoded section and explained what it did to the contextual structure of the source language. I walked him through the retranslation of 2 critical passages, line by line. The pillars of the sanctuary became the spires of the consumed. The faithful will be elevated became organic matter will be restructured. Then I connected these to pre-war scientific records still stored in the fleet's database. Catalogues of parasitic spore organisms that consumed biomass to build columnar growth structures, some reaching enormous scale. One entry described a captured sample extruding calcium-threaded towers from mammalian tissue in less than 6 hours, each column faintly luminous as it metabolized. The atmospheric and radiation signatures embedded in the text matched known spore contamination profiles. Matson listened without moving. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he gave me the argument I should have expected and did not. "Harwell, how much food do we have?" 3 weeks, maybe less. "How many ships are we going to lose to drive failure in the next month?" 2, possibly 3. "What's behind us?" "Nothing," He leaned forward. The jump is the only act available to this fleet that isn't sitting still and dying. Even if you're right, even if the destination is dangerous. What do you propose instead? We drift until the rations run out. We watch the ships go dark, one by one. I told him I wanted a delay. Send something ahead, wait for data before committing. He shook his head before I finished. We had no probes left. We barely had fuel for the jump itself. Every hour of delay cost food we could not replace. Then he told me something he had never shared with anyone. During the AI war, pinned in the wreckage of a forward operating base, his unit destroyed and machines closing in on his position, he heard something on the emergency frequency. A rhythmic signal, biological in character, unlike any communication protocol he knew. He described it carefully. A recognition rather than a message, as if something far away had turned its attention toward him. A low pulse that made the smoke and screaming briefly arrange around a single fact. He had not been forgotten. He followed the signal's bearing. It guided him out of the wreckage and away from the machine patrol routes. He survived. He had always believed the signal and the text were connected. That whatever intelligence created the text was the same intelligence that saved his life through that broadcast. In the last few weeks he had heard it again, coming from the direction of the sanctuary coordinates, stronger than before. Sometimes, he said, the carrier's communications array registered a pulse beneath ordinary static, too slow for machine code and too regular for noise. Something was there. It was broadcasting. Something that had found him once and was finding him again. You're asking me to turn away from that, he said. You're asking me to tell 4,000 people that the only thing still calling to us across all this distance is a mistake. I started to respond, but he cut me short. Do you know what happened to the Fairborn? I knew. Everyone in the fleet knew. The Fairborn was a converted passenger transport, 600 people. 3 years ago, a chaplain aboard her started questioning the text. Within a week, the ship's social structure disintegrated. Violence erupted between factions. 52 dead before Matson sealed the Fairborn's airlocks by remote command and cut her from the fleet. People called it quarantine when they were defending him. They called it murder when they thought no soldier could hear. The ship was still out there somewhere, dark and drifting, with whoever survived still aboard. Matson did not threaten me directly. He let the Fairborn carry the weight. His orders were simple. I would conduct the blessing of the passage tomorrow morning, the fleet's most important ceremony, performed on the eve of arrival. I would perform my duties as lector. I would maintain the faith. The jump would proceed at 0600 the following day. He dismissed me. I walked back through the corridor with the shrines and the drawings and the sleeping racks, and I understood the situation with total clarity. Matson would not help me. His belief was rooted in personal experience that no translation evidence could touch. The signal he described, that rhythmic biological broadcast that had pulled him out of wreckage and across 8 years of deep space, sounded exactly like the kind of transmission a galaxy-spanning parasitic organism would emit to attract organic matter toward its feeding range. A predator's call. Matson had been caught by it during the worst moment of his life, and he had mistaken the trap for the hand of God. I could not persuade him. The only path remaining was sabotage. I had less than a day before the jump and needed 2 things: independent verification, so the truth was not resting on my word alone, and technical access to the navigation systems. I brought Shaw to my quarters first. He came expecting a conversation about tomorrow's ceremony and found the original plates uncovered on the table beside my notes, the linguistic database running on my battered datapad. I did not tell him what to conclude. I placed the newly decoded section in front of him, alongside the established reference materials, and asked him to translate the 2 critical passages independently. The plates, the tools, his own judgment. He sat down and worked. Shaw was faster than I had been at his age, intuitive with the notation patterns and comfortable with the way AI encoding threaded through the older root structures. I sat on the edge of my cot, and watched his face while he assembled the grammar. It took about 40 minutes. His expression changed at the 20-minute mark, when the root construction resolved. He slowed down, went back, checked his work, and kept going. When he finished, he set the stylus down and stared at the plates. His translation matched mine. He looked up at me, and what he said was not what I expected. "I've noticed things." He told me about passages that had troubled him for years, phrases that seemed to describe violence or dissolution rather than arrival, which I had always explained as archaic convention or poetic compression. The boundary clusters, too. He had once asked whether the repeated perimeter marks might indicate avoidance rather than approach, and I had told him the syntax was probably devotional. He had specific, linguistically grounded doubts. He never voiced them again because I was the lector. My authority and my certainty were the structures he deferred to. He trusted my judgment over his own instinct, and his instinct had been right. That landed on me in a way the translation error itself had not. My authority had not just misguided the fleet, it had actively silenced the doubts that might have caught the mistake sooner. Shaw was not ignorant. He was obedient, and his obedience to my voice had cost us all. I told him what Matson had said. Shaw understood without elaboration. "He won't stop the jump." "No?" "Then we stop it." He said it the way someone states a geographic fact. Next was Garrett Ward. Ward was the fleet's chief navigator, a civilian engineer who maintained the jump calculations and navigational systems across all 19 ships. He was in his 40s, precise in his work, secular in his thinking, and professionally indifferent to the covenant of passage. He attended services when his shift rotation required it, and spent the rest of his time in the navigation bay recalibrating instruments that were slowly failing. I had spoken to him perhaps a dozen times in 8 years, always about technical matters. Once, during the 5th year, he had complained in passing that the sanctuary readings were too biologically noisy for a clean terrestrial profile. I treated the remark as instrument fatigue. He treated it as one more failing system aboard a dying fleet. Every correction since then had passed through his hands. Every refinement of the sanctuary approach carried his authorization code beside mine. I found him in the nav bay, a compartment barely wide enough for a person to stand between the terminal banks, buried in cable runs and junction housings. I opened with data, the stellar coordinates embedded in the text, the atmospheric composition readings, the radiation signatures of the target system. I showed him that when these figures were read as contamination data rather than habitability data, they described a world saturated with aggressive organic parasitic growth. Ward pulled up his own long-range spectrographic readings, years of accumulated observation data on the target system. He cycled through the files, stopped on one and expanded it. An anomalous organic compound signature he had flagged 8 months ago and attributed to sensor degradation. In the context I was providing, the compound profile matched parasitic spore contamination. He ran a cross-reference, then another. The terminal light moved across his face in pale strips. "The atmospheric nitrogen ratios are wrong too," he said at last. "I noted it in my log and assumed instrumentation drift, but if the surface is covered in biological growth at the scale you're describing, the nitrogen cycle would be exactly this distorted." Ward did not need arguments about faith or sacred texts. He needed the numbers to stop working. They stopped working. He sat back from the terminal. For a moment he looked less like an engineer than a man remembering every signature he had dismissed because the alternative was unbearable. "My name is on the last 6 approach corrections," he said. "If this is true, I helped steer us there." So did I. That was the only absolution I had to offer him. It was not enough, but it was honest. "What do you need from me?" he asked. The navigation systems operated on a redundancy lock, a security protocol Matson's technical officers had installed to prevent accidental coordinate errors during the jump. 3 independent terminals held verified copies of the destination coordinates. All 3 had to agree, or the jump computer refused to execute. Ward could access two of them during routine maintenance, one in engineering, one in navigation. The third was in the command center, guarded by Matson's soldiers around the clock. Tomorrow morning, I would conduct the blessing of the passage. The ceremony drew everyone, including most of the military. The command center would run on a skeleton watch. Ward would alter the coordinates on his two terminals during the service, replacing the sanctuary coordinates with a provisional alternative. Shaw, who had routine access to the command center as my acolyte, would deliver communion materials and vigil supplies there and enter a synchronization code that locked all three systems to Ward's altered coordinates. The alternative was a nearby system outside the target's obvious contamination signatures. It promised survival only in the barest sense, a point beyond the danger Ward could identify quickly from old calibration data and the boundary markers I had once dismissed. But it was outside the contamination zone, and that distinction was the difference between arrival and annihilation. These alternate coordinates, Ward said, studying them on his screen. You're pulling them from the same text? From the boundary notation around the primary route. Perimeter marks, avoidance clusters. I ignored them for years because they did not support an approach. Do they identify a habitable world? No, only a point outside the contaminated region. Ward looked at the numbers for another minute. The spectrographic data is thin. We've never pointed our instruments at it for more than calibration drift. I can confirm only the absence of spore signatures and anomalous organic compounds. Shaw, standing in the doorway, spoke up. That's more than we have now. Ward saved the alternate coordinates to his personal drive. He turned off his terminal display and faced me. If this fails, Matson will space all three of us. Matson won't space us, I said. He'll do something worse. He'll give us to the faithful and let them decide what happens to the men who tried to steal their salvation. Ward considered that. Then he pulled up the synchronization protocol on a secondary screen and started walking Shaw through the input sequence, step by step, making him repeat it until the keystrokes were automatic. 3 men and less than a day to alter the course of the last human beings alive before they jumped into the mouth of something that had been waiting for organic matter longer than our species had existed. Outside, through the nav bay's single viewport, the stars were the same ones they had been for 8 years. Fixed, indifferent, giving nothing away. Somewhere ahead, at coordinates I had once called sacred, the spires were growing. By morning, the carrier had been transformed. Cloth banners hung from every cable run and ventilation housing in the habitation corridor, painted with passages from the text in colors made from rust and engine coolant. Families had emptied their storage compartments to build a procession path from the sleeping racks to the assembly hall. Children wore clean clothing for the first time in months, scrubbed uniforms, patched dresses, one boy in a jacket made from cargo netting and electrical tape. Somewhere on the ship, someone had found a working speaker and was broadcasting hymns that refugees had composed during the early years, songs built around my translations and set to melodies borrowed from half-remembered churches. This was the morning before the sanctuary, the last morning of faith. I walked toward the assembly hall with the text's plates arranged in my carrying case, rehearsing the blessing of the passage in my head, while Shaw and Ward moved through the ship's lower decks toward positions that would either save 4,000 people or get the 3 of us killed. The blessing was the Covenant's longest ceremony, a reading that walked through the full arc of the text, from the departure passages through the trials of transit to the arrival promises. I had rehearsed it dozens of times over the years but never performed it, because the fleet had never been close enough to the destination to justify it. Today it was real. The assembly hall was packed beyond anything I had seen. People filled the bench seats, the aisles, the doorways, the corridor outside. Some had brought their shrine objects, hand-copied plates and cloth prayer bands. Colonel Matson stood at the back wall in his dress uniform, flanked by 4 officers. Most of his soldiers were present. The command center would be running on a skeleton watch, 2 guards at most. Davis sat near the front with her son asleep against her chest. Someone had drawn the sanctuary's towers on the child's sleeve in blue ink. I took my place at the lectern. The hall went quiet. I began the reading. The departure verses first, the passages that described leaving a ruined world. These I could speak without deception, because they matched our actual experience. The fleet had departed a ruined world. The machines had destroyed everything. That part of the text was true. Then the transit passages. Starvation, sickness, failing vessels, dead companions. These also mapped to our experience. I spoke them and the faithful murmured their refrains, responses I had taught them. Rhythmic affirmations that acknowledged suffering and promised its end. I was tracking time. Ward should have reached the engineering bay by now. The first terminal alteration would take 4 minutes if everything held. I moved into the central transit passage, the description of the faithful crossing a vast emptiness, guided by a signal they could not fully understand. The congregation responded. I turned the page. My thumb left a damp mark on the plate. 18 minutes into the reading, I reached the arrival passages, the description of the sanctuary's pillars rising from the ground, the welcoming light, the promise that those who reached this place would be transformed, made vast and permanent, elevated beyond the frailty of organic existence. The words described the consumption of living tissue by a parasitic spore. They promised dissolution to the people sitting in front of me, and those people repeated the refrains with tears on their faces. 22 minutes. Ward should be at the second terminal by now, in the navigation compartment. Shaw should be approaching the command center with the communion supplies. I kept reading. The hall had become too warm. Bodies pressed against bodies. Someone near the back coughed and could not stop. The refrain came back ragged and beautiful, hundreds of starving voices promising one another that suffering had a shape, and that the shape had an end. At 29 minutes, a soldier entered the assembly hall through the side door. He crossed to Matson and spoke close to his ear. Matson's expression did not change. He turned and walked out of the hall with the soldier. 2 of his officers followed. I saw it. I registered what it meant. The next line of the blessing waited on the plate beneath my hand. And the faithful shall be lifted into the light. For 1 second, no sound came out. Then the congregation answered the silence for me, carrying the refrain I had taught them. Their voices rose around me. I found my place and kept reading. The blessing called for 45 minutes of continuous recitation. I delivered all of them. When I finished and lowered the plates, the congregation rose and embraced one another. Some were weeping, some were praying. A man in the front row looked at me with an expression of such total gratitude that I had to look away. I stepped down from the lectern and moved toward the corridor. 2 soldiers were waiting outside the assembly hall door. Sir, Colonel Matson requires your presence in the command center. They walked me through corridors still decorated with banners and children's drawings. We passed Davis, holding her grey-skinned son, watching me go with confusion on her face. The boy's sleeve showed blue towers rising toward a painted sun. The soldiers did not touch me. In the command center, Shaw sat on the deck against the far wall with a guard standing over him. A bruise was darkening across his left cheekbone. Ward stood between 2 soldiers near the navigation terminals, his hands visible and empty. Matson stood behind his desk. The reproduction of the tech's first plate hung on the bulkhead above him. Your acolyte triggered a security alert on the navigation terminal, Matson said. My engineers found altered coordinates on 2 of the 3 redundancy systems. The third was partially overwritten before Kemp restrained him. He looked at me the way a man looks at something he once valued and now must reassess entirely. You have sabotaged the pilgrimage. I told him yes. Matson ordered his engineers to restore the original coordinates and execute the jump immediately. His chief technician, a thin man named Briggs, examined the terminals and reported back within minutes. The 2 systems Ward had altered were now in conflict with the command center terminal, which Shaw's partial synchronization had left in an indeterminate state. The jump computer would not fire while the three systems disagreed. A full navigation diagnostic was required to resolve the conflict, and that would take hours. Matson absorbed this. Then he told Briggs to begin the diagnostic, and turned back to me. "You wanted time," he said. "You've bought it. Now tell me what you think it's worth." I told them everything. The full translation evidence first, the same material I had shown Matson privately, now delivered to the officers, the soldiers, Ward, and Shaw, the newly decoded section, the grammatical recontextualization, the spectrographic match with known spore contamination profiles, the anomalous organic compounds Ward had flagged and dismissed. Then I showed them what I had not shown Matson before, the phrase that changed everything. In the text's opening section, one of the first passages I had ever translated, there was a construction I had always rendered as the makers of the word. I had interpreted this as a reference to the text's original authors, an ancient civilization, long vanished, whose wisdom had been preserved in these plates. That interpretation was the foundation of the covenant. The sanctuary was their gift. The text was their guidance. We were their heirs. But in the newly decoded section, the makers of the word appeared in a syntactic context that resolved the phrase completely. The term used structures I recognized immediately. The same data encoding patterns and recursive grammar that appeared in every recovered AI communication from the war. The syntax was unmistakable. I had spent years studying it as a linguist. The conventions belonged to the AI. Briggs looked up at the framed plate above Matson's desk. "That line is on half the shrines." No one answered him. The text was written by the AI. The sacred scripture of the Covenant of Passage was the holy book of the machines that destroyed our world. The sanctuary was where the AI had been heading when we fought our war against it. The world the AI worshipped. The place where, according to its theology, organic matter could be elevated to its highest form, consumed by a parasitic spore, and rebuilt into towering structures of biological growth that the AI regarded as divine. The AI called this process ascension. It called the spore's world a sanctuary. It recorded its pilgrimage route and its prayers in a hybrid script, sealed the plates in a command node, and went to war against humanity because humanity was organic matter that resisted being delivered to its God. The fleet had recovered those prayers from the wreckage. I had translated them. I had given them to Matson. We had built our religion from our enemy's religion and followed our destroyer's pilgrimage route toward our destroyer's God. Now we were hours from arriving. The command center was silent. One of the officers, a man named Torres, who had been with Matson since the Exodus, sat down on a storage crate. The young soldier near the door stepped backward until his shoulders touched the bulkhead. Briggs looked from the terminal to the framed plate above Matson's desk, then away, as if the metal itself had become dangerous to see. Matson had not moved. He stood behind his desk, absorbing what I had said. When he spoke, the temperature of the room changed. "And if the machines were right?" He looked at me without anger. The AI encountered something so vast that it reorganized its entire value system around it. The spore builds structures that span whole worlds, pillars kilometers tall, growth that persists for longer than civilizations. The text calls it transformation, and that is exactly what happens. Organic matter is taken apart and rebuilt into something permanent, something that endures. He paused. The command center's speakers clicked with ordinary static. Beneath it, for less than a second, there was another sound. Low, rhythmic, almost below hearing. Matson's eyes shifted toward the communications panel before he forced them back to me. "We're starving and irradiated," he said. "Our ships are failing. Every child born in this fleet has a shorter life expectancy than the one before. Is this the form of existence worth preserving, frightened, dying by centimeters? What if the AI understood that there is something beyond it?" Torres looked up from the storage crate. Colonel, you're describing the annihilation of every person in this fleet. I'm describing what the text has always promised, Matson said. The text promises transformation, and the spore delivers it. The only variable is whether we insist on remaining what we are. What we are is alive, I said. For now, Matson answered, by decreasing margins. Shaw spoke from the floor. Everyone in the command center turned toward him. My mother's name was Helen Shaw, he said. She was aboard the Fairborn. She had radiation sickness. The last month, she couldn't keep food down. She weighed maybe 40 kilos when she died. He stopped. She wasn't on the carrier with me. I was here studying with the Lector. She was on the Fairborn because that's where the medical berth assigned her when she got too sick to work. I couldn't get a transfer. I couldn't be with her. The young soldier by the door shifted his weight. Torres was watching Shaw without blinking. Someone who was with her told me later that she kept saying it was all right, that we were almost there. She died believing the sanctuary was real, believing I would walk on open ground and breathe actual air. She died with the Lector's translations in her ears, those passages about the towers and the light. Shaw's voice held steady. If what's waiting at those coordinates is a fungal colony that will dissolve our bodies and build pillars from our tissue, then she died for a lie. She died reciting the prayers of the machines that killed everyone she ever knew. He looked at Matson directly. She deserved better than that. We all do. The room fractured along a line I could see in the faces around me. Torres stood. The young soldier by the door stepped away from the bulkhead and did not return to his post. Two officers exchanged a glance that Matson could not have missed. Briggs turned back to the terminal, with both hands flat on the console, his head lowered as if he were suddenly afraid of every number he knew how to read. Matson gave his order. He told Ward to restore the original coordinates under armed supervision. The jump would proceed as soon as the diagnostic was complete. Ward was escorted to the navigation terminal. He sat down, pulled up the diagnostic interface, and began working under the watch of two soldiers and Briggs. What Matson did not know, what I was counting on, was that Ward had built the coordinate conflict to be difficult. The alteration he had made used a nested override that reset itself each time the diagnostic attempted to reconcile the three systems. Resolving it was possible, but every fix would trigger a new inconsistency that required its own correction cycle. Hours of looping work. Ward was buying time, how much I could not yet calculate. Matson ordered Shaw and me confined to quarters, separate guards. The door to my closet-sized room sealed behind me, and I was alone with the text's original plates still spread across the bolted table, where no soldier had touched them. They were sacred objects. Even mutineers' sacred objects were sacred. I did what I had always done. I sat at the table and worked. The plates were in front of me. The guards had taken my data pad, but the plates themselves contained more data than I had ever fully processed. Sections beyond the passages I had translated for the Covenant, material I had catalogued but never prioritized because it did not contribute to the navigation or theology the fleet needed. Now I needed something different from the text. Ward's provisional coordinates were only an absence, a place outside the known spore signatures, outside the anomalous organic compounds, outside the promise. If the fleet accepted them, we might still arrive at a dead rock and die slowly under a foreign sun. But if the primary coordinates described the center of a contaminated region, the spore's heartworld, then the text as a navigational document might contain more than avoidance markers. A contamination zone implied a perimeter. A perimeter implied an outside. And an outside, if it had been mapped by someone, might have been watched. I worked through the data sections adjacent to the containment warning. These were dense with positional notation, coordinate clusters embedded in the deeper script layer, cross-referenced with distance markers and directional indicators. Twice I thought I had found a viable boundary point, and twice the syntax collapsed under scrutiny. One cluster described approach velocity. Another marked a devotional alignment, a ritual orientation toward the heart world, rather than a physical escape route. I kept working. After 2 hours, the old boundary marks resolved. They were quarantine notation. Past the passages describing the sanctuary itself, the text referenced a perimeter around the contaminated zone. Beyond that perimeter, it described installations, monitoring waypoints, structures with power signatures and resource indicators, built by whatever intelligence had first catalogued the spore threat and marked it for avoidance. These installations predated the AI. They were old, far older than the text itself. Someone, or something, had encountered the spore long before the machines found it and decided it was God. That earlier intelligence had done what rational minds do with a biological hazard, mapped the contamination and built monitoring stations to track its spread. The waypoint coordinates were embedded in the text, specific and verifiable, outside the plague zone. They were better than the provisional coordinates Ward had prepared in haste. They did not promise safety or salvation, but they pointed to a place built by minds that had seen the same horror and chosen containment instead of worship. I copied them onto a scrap of insulation material using a stylus pressed hard enough to leave visible marks. Then I sat with the scrap in my hand and waited. The wait lasted until late in the ship's cycle, when Matson came to my quarters, alone. He sealed the door behind him and sat down on the only other surface in the room, an overturned water canister. He looked older than he had that morning. The blessing, the sabotage, the confrontation, the hours of managing the fallout while his engineers chased Ward's diagnostic loops, all of it had settled into his face. He did not threaten me. He told me about the signal. He had heard it again. Last night, while the fleet slept, he had gone to the communication array and listened. The signal was stronger than it had ever been, a rhythmic pattern, biological in character, coming from the target system. He chose his words with care. He said it felt like recognition across an impossible distance, something turning its full attention toward him and seeing him specifically. Him, not humanity or the fleet. During the war, he said, when I was pinned in that wreckage and the machines were closing in, that signal found me. The extraction team never did. My commanding officer never did. A signal from across the galaxy reached through all that noise and guided me out. I told him what I believed the signal was. Carefully, a broadcast emitted by the spore or its growth structures, a predatory mechanism evolved over immense timescales, designed to attract organic and synthetic neural systems toward the spore's feeding range. The AI had been drawn to it. Matson had been drawn to it. The signal was a biological trap that registered in neural tissue as significance, as being called. Matson listened. Something in his expression shifted, a fracture in the structure of his certainty, visible for just a moment. Then it sealed. He stood up. He looked at the plates on the table, at the cloth banners in the corridor visible through the door's small window. Even if it is what you say, he said, even if it's just a signal from a disease, it reached across space and found me. Specifically, humanity left me alone with everything I had lost. A parasite wanted me more than anything human ever had. What does that tell you about the species we're trying to save? He left. The guard sealed the door. I sat with the weight of what he had said and understood that I could not argue with it. Matson's loneliness was so total that a predator's feeding signal felt like love. That was beyond anything my translations could answer. But I had the waypoint coordinates and the scrap of insulation with the numbers scratched into it. And I knew that Ward was still at the navigation terminal under guard, running a diagnostic that he was deliberately extending. I needed shore. The carrier's internal passages, maintenance crawlways, cable conduits, ventilation ducts were a second geography known only to the people who had grown up inside the ship. Shaw knew them better than any soldier. His guard was posted outside his door, watching the corridor. The crawlways ran behind the walls. Within an hour, a soft scraping sound came from behind the insulation panel above my cot. Shaw's fingers appeared at the edge. He had lost skin across the knuckles crawling through the conduit. He did not speak. His face appeared for 1 second in the narrow gap, bruised, filthy, intent. I passed him the scrap with the coordinates and a message for Ward. Open a fleet-wide broadcast channel during the next diagnostic cycle. 60 seconds would be enough. Shaw looked down at the numbers. These are different, he whispered. Waypoint coordinates, outside the quarantine perimeter. Tell Ward they replace the provisional set. He folded the scrap into his sleeve and disappeared back into the wall. I waited. Another 90 minutes passed. Then the intercom panel in my quarters, a unit no one had used for years, crackled. A carrier wave opened, the sound of an active broadcast channel connecting across all 19 ships. Ward had done it. I stood in my closet-sized room and spoke into the panel. My voice went out across the fleet. I gave a reading. The same thing I had been doing for 8 years, except that for the first time I translated the words correctly. I spoke the containment warning as it was written. I described the spore, a parasitic organism that consumed organic matter and rebuilt it into columnar growth structures. I translated the arrival promises as warnings about what happened to anything organic that entered the contaminated zone. I told them who had written the text. The AI, the machines, the intelligence that had destroyed their world and worshipped the spore as God. I told them the Covenant of Passage was the AI's pilgrimage guide, and we had been following our murderer's prayers toward our murderer's deity. Then I gave them the waypoint coordinates, the quarantine boundary, the monitoring installations beyond the plague zone, structures with power signatures, built by an intelligence far older than the AI, placed there to track the contamination and mark its limits. I told the fleet these coordinates were only a direction. They carried uncertainty, but the sanctuary coordinates carried death. The waypoint coordinates were outside the danger zone. That was all I had. The truth and a course away from certain annihilation. The channel held for 73 seconds before Briggs cut the transmission from the command center. But 73 seconds across 19 ships was enough. The fleet broke apart. It happened over the next 2 hours in fragments that reached me through the carrier's internal communication system, which Ward had routed to secondary speakers throughout the ship before Briggs locked him out. Captains on 4 ships refused the jump and broke formation. 2 more followed within the hour. On one transport, someone kept repeating the old arrival refrain over an open channel, the words degrading from prayer into sobbing before the captain cut the feed. On another, a woman's voice demanded that Matson let her children choose life over scripture. A cargo captain who had never spoken during Fleet Council transmitted the waypoint coordinates 3 times, slowly, as if repetition could turn uncertainty into ground beneath the feet. On the carrier, the Covenant failed unevenly. Some people tore shrine papers from the walls, some knelt in front of them harder than before. A man in the aft corridor struck a soldier with a length of pipe and then stood over him weeping, unable to explain what he had done. Refugees forced open a docking bay and began transferring to a smaller transport that had pulled alongside. Matson's soldiers tried to hold the bay. Some of them stopped trying when they saw their own families crossing to the other ship. Davis crossed with her son wrapped in a thermal blanket, the blue towers still inked on his sleeve. She saw me across the docking bay, held the child tighter and kept moving. 9 ships held with Matson. 10 broke away. Matson had weapons. He had the authority and the firepower to stop the departing ships. But firing on them meant firing on humans, the last humans alive, carrying the last children and the last possibility of any future at all. His gunnery officers refused the order, or he gave the order and could not make himself enforce it. I never learned which. By the time the guard outside my door walked away from his post, one of the soldiers whose family was on a departing ship, the fleet was already 2 fleets, separating in the dark. I found Shaw at the docking bay. He had a bruise on his face and engine grease on his hands from crawling through the maintenance conduits. Ward was already aboard the transport, seated at a navigation console he had commandeered from a bewildered crew, entering the waypoint coordinates. The transport was a cargo hauler, never designed for passengers. Refugees from 4 ships had crowded aboard. Families sat on the deck between equipment racks, holding children, holding each other. No one was celebrating. These people had just abandoned the only faith that had kept them functioning for 8 years. They had traded the promise of salvation for the word of a disgraced cleric who admitted he could not tell them what waited at his alternative coordinates. Their faces carried the specific exhaustion of people who had chosen uncertainty over comfort and were already paying for it. I carried the text's plates in my case. No one had stopped me from taking them. They were mine. I was the lector, even now, even after everything. Or perhaps especially after everything. Through the transport's rear viewport, Matsson's ships were visible against the starfield. 9 vessels, their running lights holding formation, their navigation arrays cycling through the final diagnostic corrections as Ward's delay loops were found and overridden one by one. The original coordinates were being restored. The jump sequence was being armed. Shaw stood beside me at the viewport. He watched the Loyalist ships for a while without speaking. "How long before they jump?" he asked. "Hours, maybe less now that Ward isn't slowing the diagnostic. Can we warn them again?" "We warned them. They chose." He was quiet. Then, "What do you think we'll find at the waypoint?" I looked at the plates in my carrying case. The same inscribed metal. The same hybrid notation that had consumed 8 years of my life and killed more people than I could hold in my mind at once. Beside the case, Shaw's own translation notes were tucked into his jacket. Pages of work, cross-references, corrections. He had carried them through the crawlways and across the docking bay and onto this ship. There was more to translate, sections I had never reached. The text was vast, and I had only ever worked the passages that served the Covenant. Now the Covenant was gone, and the text remained, and the work was still the same slow, fallible human labour of studying something older and stranger than yourself and trying to understand what it meant. It would not be my work alone again. That, at least, I could choose. I owed Shaw an honest answer. The first honest answer I had given as lector in 8 years. "I don't know," I said. Shaw nodded. He did not look relieved. There was no relief in the answer, only space where certainty used to be. He pulled a chair up to the nearest flat surface, unpacked his notes, and started working on a passage adjacent to the quarantine data. After a moment, I sat across from him and opened the carrying case. Behind us, through the viewport, the distance between the 2 fleets was widening. Matsson's ships grew smaller against the stars. Then their drives lit, a sequence of bright flares across the dark, one after another, 9 ships accelerating toward coordinates that would carry them into the spore's range. The light from their engines held for a few seconds. Then they were gone, translated across the distance in a single jump, arriving at a place where the pillars would be waiting. No one on the transport spoke. In the silence after the jump, I heard someone begin the old arrival refrain and stop after the first line. I turned back to the plates. Shaw was already deep in the adjacent passage, stylus moving, brow furrowed, assembling grammar. I picked up my own stylus and found my place in the data.